Hello, my name is Aiko. I'm International Volunteering and Alumni Officer at the University of York. I'd like to welcome you to, on behalf of the University of York Global Alumni Association, to this panel discussion. How has the COVID-19 has changed our media consumption? Before handing over to our chair, I'd like to remind you that this session will be recorded and will be available later online. And your camera and microphone will remain switched off. You can ask questions to the panel by typing in the Q&A box throughout the event. The speakers will answer them at the end of the session. So now I'd like to introduce our chair, Ross Slade. He's a graduate of York, studied English in 1992. So Ross, over to you.
Thank you, Aiko. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event. So as like I said, I'm Ross Slight, and I'm going to be chairing. I'm currently the Chief Strategy Officer at a company called SOMO in a digital product accelerator, and I chair and advise a number of digital startups and scale-ups as well. And I'm fascinated by this question of how COVID-19 has changed our media consumption, particularly during the pandemic itself, but how that's going to change our consumption moving forward into the new normal. And to help us explore this topic, I'm going to draw upon this fantastic panel that I've got with me. We've got 4 guests. I'd like to thank them very much indeed for all their, in advance for all their time and for their participation, their insights coming from very different viewpoints, because this is a very rich and wide-ranging topic. And what I'll do is I'll give an in-depth introduction to each of our panelists before they speak. I'm going to ask them to speak for 5 or so minutes to give their point of view, their experiences, their insights, and then we're going to go to the real meat of this, which is the discussion. And what I'd really like us to do is to be as involved as we possibly can do. I'd like to welcome you all. From around the world, I see that we've got participants from the UK, Japan, China, Australia, USA, Germany, Kenya. We've got lots of different viewpoints, and it'd be fascinating to get your views of how COVID is changing in your particular countries and in your particular sectors and areas, but also to get questions which will allow the panel to be able to explore that and some of the insights which they've given, and try and draw together an answer to this question of how it has changed our media consumption. So I'd really encourage you to utilize the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen down there. Write your questions in. Whilst the panelists are speaking, I'm going to allow them to run without asking any questions, and then we'll draw together those questions at the end and open that up into a wide-ranging Q&A session for 20-25 minutes. But like all these things, all these events, they depend on us being able to be as involved as we possibly can be. So I'd encourage you to give us your viewpoints, give us your thoughts on how COVID has changed our media consumption, particularly because we've got such a wide-ranging global viewpoint here, and also where things which the panelists have talked about in terms of their insights, how we can begin to go in a bit more in depth into those if they're particularly interesting to you. So without further ado, let's crack on with this. So I'd like to introduce our first panelist, which is Dr. Snehashish Banerjee, who is a lecturer in marketing at the York Management School. So he's part of the faculty here at York. He studied computer science, engineering, information systems, information studies, so a very wide-ranging interdisciplinary background, and his research focuses on human technology interaction. And so we'll be really interested to get Snehashish's viewpoints on both the concepts of what digital usage is changing, what's happening within the news arena, what's happening with our behavior, both from a group perspective and from an individual perspective. So if I can ask you to come online now, Snehashish, and talk about that for 5 minutes or so, that'd be fantastic.
Thank you very much, Ross, and warm greetings to everybody. To shed light on how COVID-19 is changing our media consumption, I will specifically focus on the online and digital media. This is because over the last 8 years, that is what I have been studying. A large part of my research focuses on people's online information behavior and how they interact with technology. So I will explain the change in digital media consumption in terms of 3 S's: searching, sharing, and susceptibility. For each of the 3, I will also offer some research-based and also personal insights so that we can actually strengthen our media consumption habits going forward. So the first S is searching. And I'm sure each of you have Googled COVID-19 and coronavirus quite a few times over the last few months. And you probably did not do that, say, in 2019 or 2018. And I think that's a big change in our search patterns, in our Googling patterns. And there are both pros and cons to this change. Good news first. Research shows that searching COVID-related information is positively associated with prevention behaviors such as willingness to wash hands and avoid crowded places. But time for some bad news. The downside is that information seeking elevates anxiety. While searching once in a while to meet information needs is fine, people need to be wary of cyberchondriac tendencies. In case you're wondering what is cyberchondria, cyberchondria refers to the phenomenon whereby repeated internet searches regarding medical information result in excessive concerns about health. It can be quite distressing, and we need to be mindful of this. I think I was almost becoming cyberchondriac when the pandemic initially started, but I tried to kind of resist it as I went along. Now time for the second S. The second S is sharing. As a consequence of searching, people are usually exposed to an avalanche of information. The World Health Organization calls it the infodemic. It contains fake news, but camouflaged amid accurate facts. And hence, even well-meaning individuals often end up inadvertently sharing fake news to their social networks. Unsurprisingly, COVID-related misinformation is regarded as a huge problem today. So I think sharing COVID-related information is fine, but we must check our sources to curb the spread of misinformation and fake news as much as possible. And finally, the third S is susceptibility. According to a recent survey of some 4,000 internet users conducted by a market research company, people are spending a lot of time watching online videos, and I'm no exception. This was found to be true across all generations and genders. So our favorite video streaming platforms, in a way, seem to be increasing our susceptibility to digital temptations. They are promoting our willingness to indulge in binge watching. Hence, there is a need to manage digital temptations. There is a need to exercise what I call personal digital restraint. So very quickly to wrap up, I've spoken about the 3 S's. Searching. With respect to searching, I would say it is okay to search information daily basis, on a regular basis, once in a while, but we need to guard against cyberchondria. With respect to the second S of sharing, it is okay to share information about COVID, but we need to check the accuracy first. If we are unsure about the accuracy, probably it is better not to share, because it is always better to be a dead end in the path of fake news propagation rather than a friction-free alley. And finally, in terms of the final S, susceptibility, I think it is absolutely fine to watch online videos for entertainment purposes, but one should be wary of addiction. I think it is almost like mindfulness in the digital setting. Just as mindfulness is often recommended to keep addiction at bay, similarly, digital mindfulness can help us better manage our digital distractions and hence bolster our digital media consumption habits. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Snehashish, thank you very much indeed for that. That's fantastic. I mean, I've now got at least 3 new terminologies in order to be able to talk about, cyberchondria and infodemic. Fascinating to see where that has grown within the COVID period, but also the impact on us personally and how we utilize our media and how we look at that. So that's great first insight. I'd now like to introduce our next panelist, who is Richard Davidson Huston, who was a graduate from English in '95 from York. And so Richard's been involved in the internet really as soon as he graduated from the university, and developed a serious interest in the effect of new technologies on content production, distribution, and consumption. After a stint of working at Microsoft, he joined Channel 4 and became responsible for 4OD and then All 4. And now he runs an international consultancy for broadcaster-owned video-on-demand services, and is also Director of Audiences and Media at Glyndebourne Opera. So has two different perspectives coming on this from both the cultural and from the business perspective side of things. Richard, I'd like to ask you to come in and share your insights with us on this question.
Thank you very much, Ross, and hello everybody. I hope everybody's doing well and your friends and family are staying well for this strange period. Here I am at home, running my, as Ross kindly called it, international consultancy, and I've been gloriously, therefore, unaffected in that respect, for which I'm extremely fortunate and grateful. I wanted to give a couple of thoughts on this topic, one from the supply side, and secondly, on the demand side. And I'm going to reflect a little bit on television, video on demand, and also theatre. So on the supply side in television, as many of you be aware, the television networks have been affected very seriously by the end of live events. Here in the UK, Glastonbury and Wimbledon and the European Football Championships would have otherwise filled the schedules during the summer, and the networks who rely on all of those hours, including of course the Olympics, have found themselves scrambling to fill their schedules with other stuff. Now, some of that other stuff is fairly low quality, and some of that other stuff is lots and lots of repeats. What's been interesting is to find that audiences are less concerned about quality and repeats than perhaps broadcasters had imagined they might be. And if you work in video on demand and have seen the trends around classic television series, not least amongst which is Friends, which has become a global hit again, that perhaps will come as less of a surprise than if your job is to fill the TV schedules with brand new content of the highest possible quality all the time. On the supply side, with respect to theatre, and of course all the theatres in the UK and most of them around the world have been closed, it's forced venues to think about their brands and to stop equating the brand with the venue as though it's the same thing. This has been a very interesting and late reaction to the new internet connected world that we live in. And theatre have been perhaps the last of the entertainment media to think about the difference between the venue in which they originated, the physical space, and the opportunities afforded to their brands by the internet. So that's the supply side. And then to the real question, which is demand side and behavioral change. Well, all behavior is affected by context. And as my colleague just spoke about, part of that context has to do with the virus and staying well. There's been a flight to the quality news, which is a great relief when one thinks about the fun and games of fake news over the last several years. But when fake news has the capacity to make the difference between life and death, so public service news, not least in the UK, being provided by the BBC, has, I think, proven itself again to be a central pillar of an effective democracy. Of course, it's not all just news and information. People want to escape and indulge and perhaps exhibit less personal digital restraint than they might otherwise. And so the escapism into the box set, into the big video on demand providers has accelerated a trend that has been very, very strong, as everyone recognizes, has been accelerated in the context that we find ourselves. However, it's not all good news for new media, because podcasts, which have been seeing huge growth in 2019 have been in decline or flattening. Why? Because of the context of use. That's to say, those liminal moments, commuting, walking from A to B, those little bits of time that are the in-between times have been taken away from most people. That's probably a suspension, but it has been interesting to see how dependent podcasts had become on specific available moments of time. And then finally, on the demand side, for those audiences who take their media live in theatre, it's been quite extraordinary to see the disruption to people's lives of not being allowed to witness live performance in the presence of other people. It's been almost a mental health crisis for the most dedicated and devoted to the creative, to the culture sector, and a real desperation to return to the witness of live events together. And I think, Ross, I'll leave it there and leave those hanging for people to perhaps come back and ask questions about later on. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Richard. That's a fascinating viewpoint to see multiple different strands, both on that supply and demand side. And I think that we'll definitely be coming back to the impact of this sort of as we enter into the new normal in the Q&A. So I'd like to introduce next Adelle De Souza, who graduated from York in management in 2011. And particularly we'd like to thank Adelle because she's coming all the way from over from Sydney at the moment. So she's based in Sydney, so it's I'm not quite sure exactly what time at night it is, but thank you very much indeed for coming in to join us. And Adelle's currently digital marketing manager at the Macquarie Telecom Group, and is also founder of Hire. That's H-I-R-E, Hire, H-I-G-H-E-R, in the UK. And so Adelle's been working both in marketing in the UK and in Australia, you know, doing amazing things, launching brand, instigating campaigns, leveraging social media, managing all of the agency networks and structures, and leading national and international events. And she's going to talk from those two perspectives of both working in the corporate world, but also from her own career's education business, Hire. And so I'd like to welcome Adelle in from Sydney, all the way next to the stage, please. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you very much, Ross. Yeah, it's about 9:20 in the evening here. So a few hours ahead, but given our global audience, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Yes, as Ross mentioned, I have a kind of a double view on things that's happening at the moment. And I think the biggest things that I wanted to cover was actually the impact on generation, the country to which you're living in and are experiencing COVID-19 within. You know, keeping in touch with my friends and family at home, but also the careers education business I have at home, which understandably has been affected given the schools closures, versus the life impacts that COVID-19 has had here in Australia. And then thirdly, the impact that it's had on marketing in terms of taking that from an academic perspective and now doing it in the day-to-day, which is what I do here as a day job. So initially I want to start with generation. A few of my esteemed panelist colleagues have mentioned the difference in generation and how consumption has changed. We've seen it massively. If I think about my day job, which is a B2B IT company, we particularly target, I mean, our target audience would be somebody the age of 45, maybe through to about 55. The way that they're now consuming media. Now, media for us at that point is content, it's information. Anyone who has done any kind of marketing knows that content is king, and understanding your audience goes a long way to making sure that king stays on the throne. And then looking at what Hire does, and we spend a lot of our time talking to 16 to 21-year-olds in terms of their options of what they do after the classroom. So generationally, we've seen a massive change. We're getting a lot more requests for video content from the younger generations, whereas a lot more written content for the slightly older generations in the P2P market. We're seeing a shift in terms of the types of questions. How is COVID going to affect my business? How is COVID going to affect my family life? How is COVID going to affect my work life? but then equally the same for higher. The students are also saying, how is COVID going to affect my career? How is COVID going to affect the choices that I made when I selected my GCSEs, if based in the UK, for example? So it's really interesting for us to see the different levels of questions and how long that period lasts. We had a reasonably long time frame for how long people were concerned about the impacts of COVID here in Australia, because we've had a much shorter time of experiencing lockdown by comparison to those of you in Europe, certainly, and to a degree the US, depending on what state you're from, to what we've seen in the UK, which I think takes me nicely onto the geographical split. To put it in context, Australia has 7,500 cases, confirmed cases of coronavirus. The UK has had something like 300,000. So massive difference. The lifestyle has been different. The lockdown has been different. Essential services for us in Australia has been very different. Prime example, hairdressers have remained open. Schools remained open in part. We were kind of supported by the fact that it fell over holidays. Equally, coronavirus hit us during the winter season. And so the gear up and the support and the infrastructure to tackle the normal winter flu was already in place to then be heightened. So we had a really different experience of COVID here. And I think that's had a really big impact in the way that we're seeing a change in consumption, especially for my role as digital marketing manager, which is predominantly Australian focused. We only look realistically at other Australian organisations that are looking to migrate their services to the cloud. So I think it's really important to maintain the difference in the two. Life here, by comparison to my UK counterparts, has seemed relatively normal. Yes, the pubs have been closed, but we've been able to have takeaway and Uber Eats and Deliveroo from the very beginning. Gyms, given the focus on well-being and lifestyle here, immediately went online the very next day. So lifestyle has had a big part to play, and I think that's quite important to take into account. And then the third and final point that I thought was worth mentioning was, everybody has heard of B2B marketing from an academic perspective, and B2C marketing. And there was a topic that was raised, certainly when I was studying marketing, I would say back in the day, at York Management School, was the concept of H2H marketing, human to human marketing. One of the biggest things that we've seen, both in my day job and in the business that's running at home, is we're now marketing and selling to people. We are aware that they're no longer just job titles. They're not IT managers. They are fathers and teachers and, you know, coaches and counsellors at times. And that's been really interesting, and it's made a massive shift in the way that we're now creating content. We're recognising that the people that we sell to want to go home at 5 p.m. And it's made a real difference to us in terms of the events that we offer. A lot of our events, and I think we'll go on to this hopefully later on in the Q&A, a lot of our events will remain virtual. I think digital technology historically has made quite a blur between home and work-life balance, and COVID certainly here in Australia has kind of put another light on that to say we need that balance, we need the split, even if you do have your work emails on your phone constantly. So hopefully there's a few pieces there that have triggered. I know there's lots to come in the questions, and my fellow panelists have got lots to add. But yeah, I've certainly seen a difference in B2B world in Australia versus, I suppose, B2C world in the UK, targeting completely different generations at completely different points of their life, and the responsibilities that they hold in and outside of COVID world. So that's me, and I'll pass back to Ross.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed, Adelle. That's fascinating. I think the generational aspect of things is going to become really an interesting topic for discussion later. You know, whether there's fundamental changes in consumption amongst those generations, or whether there is just an acceleration of what was already happening with regards to their consumption patterns. And particularly when we start looking at the younger generations and how they are operating. So I will return to that in the Q&A, but I'd like to ask our fourth panelist to come forward onto the stage. Alicia Judge. Alicia is a video producer and entertainment journalist. She's got a huge knowledge and expertise, particularly within the gaming sector. And we were discussing just before this, you know, gaming as a sector now is wider and larger than, you know, music and film put together. It's a fantastically vibrant area, but often missed by mainstream media in a way. Alicia's doing a lot to change that. She's a producer for Netflix UK YouTube channel, but she's also hosted and written and produced for Sky News, BBC Radio 1, Al Jazeera, IGN, Guardian, every single quality news outlet and content outlet there, particularly within regard to gaming. She's presenter and commentator for Nintendo UK events, BAFTA Games Awards. So this is going to come with two, I think, quite different perspectives. One from her view of her work which she does with Netflix, and one which is also about in the gaming arena and how that consumption has changed. So Alicia, if you'd like to take the stage, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, first of all, hi everyone, and also an apology. It looks really idyllic over my shoulder, like there's a lot of lush green vegetation, but I am in London and there's a building site right next to us, so you will sort of be treated to the sounds of drilling, and if we're lucky, sirens. But as Ross said, so yeah, I'm a freelance video producer and I work across two sectors, Netflix and video games. So I want to briefly start with Netflix, because obviously streaming services have been such a huge part of our lockdown life, but then I really want to move into video games. But yeah, so I'm a producer and editor on Netflix UK's YouTube channel. So we make editorial content around Netflix shows. It will be stuff like interviews with cast and crews, deep dives into how something was made, sort of video essays, looking at different cultural things that Netflix shows pull out on, which as an English grad, I love. But yeah, I can't share viewing figures about what people have been watching on Netflix, because none of that is public. But yes, it's no secret that streaming services like Amazon Prime, like Netflix, have done really well. They do well out of these times, whether it's a recession or a pandemic, where people come inside and they don't have either the money or the time to go outside. We turn to storytelling in film and TV. But I'm less interested in talking about the numbers and more interested in talking about what people have been watching, which I found really interesting, because this period has seen a huge focus on social justice. In this lockdown period, not only have we been dealing with the pandemic, we've been dealing with a seismic shift in movements like Black Lives Matter, discussions around trans rights with J.K. Rowling and her tweets. There's been a lot of conversations about what we can do as a society to change real systemic issues. But we're all indoors, and these, some people don't feel safe going out to protest. We're limited in terms of what we can physically do. And what we've been seeing in terms of the engagement of content at Netflix is that people have gone, okay, I really want to educate myself, but people are also quite mentally drained and don't necessarily want to pick through lots of articles and think pieces online. So they turn to documentaries, and it's not just on sites like Netflix. Amazon Prime have incredible documentaries about the Black experience. Channel 4 have documentaries that go back to the 90s that look at cases of racial injustice, and all of these have sort of been brought to the fore. So that's really interesting, seeing how streaming services in terms of what we consume in lockdown can be used as an educational resource. Also, obviously, escapism like Floor is Lava. I don't know if you guys have watched that, but sort of like entertainment shows have been huge in terms of people really wanting to escape their reality. And also things like horror. There's something called the paradox of horror, where we actually find comfort in watching horror movies. Sounds really strange, but it's because horror has really set rules. And, we know that you shouldn't go down the basement, and you'll scream, no, don't split up, to the people on your screen and these characters. And that's really comforting, because when our lives are so uncertain, when the rules are literally constantly changing about how we can live our lives, you watch a horror movie and everything sort of falls into place. You know how you navigate and survive that world. So we're seeing horror being a thing that people are watching. So that's been really interesting. That's a brief overview of sort of Netflix, but I really want to turn attention to video games, because my bread and butter, since graduating from York, has been the video games industry. And people have always played games loads, even outside of lockdown. Gaming has never been a minority, as Ross said. It brings more money into the UK economy than film, TV, and music combined. So it's a huge, huge industry and is often overlooked. But yeah, gaming has seen a huge uptick, like all other sectors, in lockdown. Especially social gaming has been a huge trend. Microsoft has reported a 130% increase in multiplayer engagement across lockdown. And that's something that I really want to chat about, that's fascinating. I think there's a stereotype of games that they can be a very selfish pursuit almost. This idea of the teenage boy sat in his room with the curtains drawn, not coming out, and it's such a redundant stereotype. Gaming is connecting everyone, whereas some, streaming, you lean back in your entertainment, you watch something happen. In a game, you lean forward. You don't just watch characters solve their problems, you solve them for them. So yeah, we've seen Animal Crossing. Some of you might have played it. That launched perfectly timed at the beginning of lockdown and has sold 13.5 million copies. And it's a game about building a community, trading with others, navigating social spaces. And we've seen gaming become these sort of virtual grounds to bring people together. So it feels like they're occupying the same space, even when they're scattered all over the world. I've been playing Call of Duty Warzone every lunchtime with my colleagues at Netflix because we can't be in the same office, but for an hour we're working together and pursuing a goal. In Fortnite, there was a Travis Scott concert that saw over 12 million people attend that concert. Imagine a concert of 12 million people in real life. These are huge spaces that have been created in gaming that have brought people together. And the same is true of content engagement. Twitch, which is a streaming service where people watch people play games, has seen a 50% increase in views. So yeah, gaming has done amazingly, and I'm aware that I'm probably running out of time slightly, but that's sort of like one of the last things that I want to draw attention to is not just the higher figures, but also the power of games to spark conversation. So a game called The Last of Us 2 has just launched last week, and it sparked discussions around grief and empathy. Games aren't just spaces for us to come together physically, they're also places for us to grapple with issues like mental health, real world issues like, without giving away any spoilers, do not worry, I'm not going to spoil The Last of Us 2, but a big part of it is dismantling the premise of protagonist and antagonist, and looking at empathizing with the people that you truly disagree with or can't understand their worldview. And as we've seen in lockdown, with inflated sort of tensions online, that's been a huge thing. And games like The Last of Us really give us a space to literally walk a mile or 20 hours in someone else's shoes and sort of engage with that. So yeah, in terms of the future of games and where we're going to go coming out of this, I think it'll be really interesting to see how, lapsed gamers have obviously come in during this period. I think that's part of why gaming numbers have increased. We've seen people who used to play games as a kid who didn't have time now as adults, playing Animal Crossing, playing online games. So it'll be interesting to see whether they stay and stick around. But yeah, to conclude, on streaming services, obviously viewer numbers have increased, but I think the most interesting thing is what people are watching and how they're using it to educate themselves. And in games, yeah, hopefully this period has helped people who weren't familiar with games kind of come back in, and also sort of engage more with gaming in terms of its cultural relevance, its power, and its ability to connect people and help us grapple with really, really complicated issues in really empathetic ways. Yeah, really looking forward to hearing if you guys have got any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Alicia. That's a great insight, particularly into the gaming sector and what people are watching. So I'd like to bring all the panelists back now to the floor for a Q&A, if that's okay. And everyone in the audience, please start tapping away on your Q&A questions. We've got a couple coming through now, but I'd like to, if everyone can unmute and come back onto the stage, that would be fantastic. Everyone's back, great. Snehashish, Richard, Adele, Alicia, everyone welcome back. That's great. So one of the things I wanted to just pick up on as we left with gaming was just talk about this. One of the questions from the floor is about, with more things going digital, is there a danger of losing the social interaction and sharing media? So for example, when you go to a cinema or play a video game, we've been locked out of the social interactions and how we've operated with media, the way in which we've changed our consumption, and maybe being more lean back than lean forward. Do we think that there's going to be a massive change in terms of how people are, are we all going to go back, just purely back to social interaction, go back to how we consume media beforehand as a consumption rather than interaction? Or do we think that those medias which have allowed us to be able to engage, such as gaming, are going to continue to grow? I don't know, Alicia, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, from a gaming perspective, I mean, we've seen a trend even pre-lockdown. We call it local multiplayer. So, when you would play games, you might play Mario Kart with people on the same sofa. There are less games that do local multiplayer. For years, a lot of multiplayer has been moving to online experiences, things like Fortnite, cooperative gameplay that plays online. So lockdown's not necessarily affected that in too many ways. I think lockdown has just been a reminder that gaming is this space where people can come together and solve issues and grapple with things. Yeah, I mean, and a big part as well of gaming is, the Comic-Cons and we have esports where people go and fill huge stadiums and watch people playing games. So there are also physical world interactions that happen with gamers where people really come together, and I think that's something that people are really missing at the moment. Like, people are really hungering for that. That's not a sense that people are necessarily changing their habits, going, oh, this is fine, lean back, we can stay like this. Fundamentally, humans are really adaptable. That's part of the reason why in lockdown, for all of us, a lot of us have adapted well to working from home. Businesses have figured out new ways of running, new programs. And I feel like the games industry will adapt again when we move back out and partly go backwards and be able to kind of like create these physical spaces as well. Yeah.
Great. So Richard, you were talking about the physical space, particularly when it came down to the cultural aspect of things and that social impact there. Have you got any more thoughts on that in terms of, will it go back to what it was? Or will we be?
Yeah, well, I suppose there are two ways to answer that question. One is on a technical level, when and whether physical venues will be able to go back to operating in the way that they have done for hundreds or thousands of years, which is to pack human beings in closely together and invite them all to suspend their disbelief in front of a story as it's told for them. That's perhaps a different subject, because it looks at the moment that day might be quite a long way off, that we're prepared to do that again. Even, Adele, in Australia, where you've had relatively little impact from COVID-19, theatres remain closed, and the days of returning to those mass gatherings feels a long way off. But if you set that aside, what does seem to have happened is people have recognised the special quality of that experience, which is to say that for human beings to be transformed out of themselves together, willingly, to pretend together in real time, is extraordinary. And I keep being reminded of the lyric, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And there's a sort of romance in the absence of things, whether it's Glastonbury or Wimbledon or the opera or the ballet or Comic-Con, whatever it is. I do feel like demand is strangely strong. It's just that supply is impossible. So Ross, we'll have to wait and see. But I think when these things become available again, I think people will flood back.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. So, but do you think there's and again a question from the floor here in terms of when you talked about venues or distinguishing between a brand and a venue, right? And the way in which Comic-Con or the National Theatre, they are more than just the physical events themselves. There's the community, there's the insights and everything going forward in there. Do you think that will continue in terms of that, with or without the live event being in there? Do they need to rethink what they're doing? And then I think there's a secondary question to this, which I'll open to everyone, which is, which talks. I'll come to that. But do you think they'll need to change fundamentally?
Yeah, I'll just take that question quickly as it's a follow-on. So the straight answer is yes, because what the crisis has done in positive ways is to accelerate transformation. And what industries such as theatre, which haven't had to transform, but sort of thought about it, have now been forced to. And so it didn't mean that they shouldn't have done in the first place. They should have done, but they didn't have to. But take the television industry, which I worked in previously. It was forced to transform by insurgent global competitors, such as Netflix, for example. The theatre industry has been able not to, by relying on an aging audience to continue to behave in the way that they've behaved for the last few centuries. And so, yeah, the newly adopted behaviours, they were always there. They were just on the fringes, and now that's all there is. Yeah, so there's no going back.
There's no going back. Fundamental change required, which sort of leads me on to my next question, which is that with all of this new content coming in, not just the content in the cultural sector, but the ways in which we can communicate and engage in media, as well as the huge wealth of content that is available for us to be streamed there. Who are the winners out of this? Who are the people who are going to really, or not necessarily individual companies, but who are the people that people are going to turn to? Because there's a necessity for curation. There's a necessity for being able to understand user needs. I mean, Adelle, you were talking about human to human. This is exactly what we're in a position of. And when you're media, the very definition of media is mass, niche, and on that basis. And so, who do we think is going to be the winners out of this? Or, and again, I'll come on to that next question there. Or is this a media generational thing, and we're just going to see winners in generations?
I think when I think of it from a marketing content, and I know that there's a difference in terms of media and content. For us, the winners are going to be the public. One of the things that we noticed is that very early on there was lots of reactive. Oh, I need to download Netflix. I need to get Disney Plus. I need to, from our perspective, I need to upgrade to the cloud. I need to make sure that all my staff can work remotely. I need to get Microsoft Teams. I need to get Google Hangouts. It was all very quickly. And then 2 weeks later, it became, okay, now that we've dealt with the crisis, let's reflect, let's educate, let's spend some time reading. And I think now people have gone, we can take time. One of the things that I read recently was this idea that COVID has given us an abundance of time that before we just felt we didn't have time to do anything. And I think long term it'll be for me anyway, the end users that win, because they'll take the time to find the information that it is that they're looking for, rather than just consuming what's thrown at them.
Great. Anyone else want to talk about who's going to be the winners out of that, or will we agree that the public with more time is going to be the ultimate winner?
So I agree with Adelle. I'll answer the question really bluntly in terms of TV and mass media, that the big global video on demand services are going to win. And they, in a way, probably likely to win anyway, but this has accelerated their advantage. And the amount of growth in video on demand for Netflix, Amazon Prime, and other more niche services has been extraordinary, and probably taken a couple of year leap that accelerated by a couple of years where they were going to be at anyway. So I think what we'll see is a continued problem for broadcasters other than major national broadcasters, and distinct advantages and behavioural change towards video on demand services.
The one thing that I'd also jump in on to talk about with streaming services is, one thing that Netflix and all other streaming services have been hit by is productions grinding to a halt. So I think the thing that I'm interested in seeing is what's going to happen in like 9 months' time to a year, when all the shows that were meant to be launching can't launch because they were delayed by 3 or 4 months. So Netflix is a streaming service, but it could be cancelled by its user at any time if they don't feel like they're getting fresh new content. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see, considering that coronavirus has impacted the sorts of content that streaming companies can create, where the content will be coming from in a year and how that will affect streaming companies.
We'll just watch Friends again.
I think I've gone through that series about 18 times with my kids as well. So this is so obviously more and more time and more time to consume. Snehashish, I want to bring in something that you were talking about, which is the impact on the individual, and this we're constantly having to filter fake news. We're potentially spending more time on our digital devices, but potentially not having as much interaction as we would have had in the physical world digitally, and that type of interaction is different. How do you see the impact on the individual?
Yep. Thank you for the question. I think the fact that we have a whole lot of video streaming services and a whole lot of content to choose from, it's really great. I mean, we have a lot of options. But having said that, there is also, I mean, if we can always look at everything like glass half full or glass half empty. I mean, because we are now spoiled for choices, there could be a problem of like information overload. And I mean, it is great that we have the option to fall back on this kind of services to entertain ourselves, for escapism and to escape from the current situation, which is not all that promising. But then also we must ensure that we use them in the right kind of way, so that we are not really using that escapism to kind of procrastinate our work, or we are not using that kind of delay what we are supposed to do, and maybe in our work days we shouldn't be spending too much time. So it's almost about, it's very important to set clear goals from an individual perspective. When you are going online, when you are going digital, it's very important that you are self-aware and self-conscious about what you are doing, because if you are not, probably you are going to fall in for all sorts of digital temptations and distractions that will eat up a lot of your time.
Yeah, I think we see we've got to be aware of the mental effects of everything that is happening during this period, the anxiety and the issues. And I think whether we use media for escapism or we use it for searching, the effect on individuals is kind of. I mean, I've just seen my screen time just gone through the roof, which I'm not sure is a very, very good thing. And I think that's an interesting question from the floor, which I'm not quite sure I'm going to be able to interpret correctly. But the question is, will there be a class divide? And I wonder whether that is both, are we going to see divisions in society that come out because of the COVID-19 with regards to media consumption? Is there going to be people who've got access to high-speed broadband and want to engage within cultural events and everything that are going on digitally, or are we in a perspective whereby there's also going to be a divide with people who are feeling completely overwhelmed versus completely on top of everything? Are we going to see divisions in society which are going to be hard to bring back?
I'm really glad that question got asked, because it's something that I really wanted to bring up in relation to the games industry. It's a really important question. At the beginning of this lockdown, we were talking about how coronavirus was indiscriminate, but it's really not. It does affect people disproportionately. And in the games industry, so we had a diversity survey recently, and no one had ever done a huge census on games industry studios and the makeup of them and where our workers were coming from. And it found that 81% of the industry is educated to at least undergraduate level. You compare that to other cultural and creative industries like TV and film, they only have a 57% average. So the games industry is super highly educated. But then, that we also know that the games industry is incredibly white and it is incredibly male. And so, we're seeing this sort of flow issue in terms of how we're getting people in. And when coronavirus is impacting who's going to university, who can afford to go to university, 62% of the games workforce comes from households where the main earner works in a managerial or a professional role. If you're a 16-year-old who wants to go into the games industry and your parent works in hospitality, and hospitality has been incredibly negatively impacted by coronavirus, you're not going to have the money to buy the games, to engage in games culture. Gaming is incredibly expensive. Animal Crossing costs around £60 to play. So, you're being left out of a conversation, but also your road to university to then get into the job. It's damaging. And I think as the games industry, we really need to be doing more outreach into schools, more programs and work experience, inviting people in, you know, working with universities, working with families, and some studios are doing that. Media Molecule, who make Dreams, and Little Big Planet, they do an incredible job of, you know, going in and to schools and then inviting students and working with them and creating internships. And, you know, we need a lot more of that to ensure that this period doesn't just enforce a sort of uniform social standard that we're seeing already in the games industry and its workforce.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that. Obviously, a lot of the work that we do with careers education, we talk to young people about what they want to do next in gaming, in some of the more sort of disadvantaged areas that we work in, certainly in London. Having the conversation with the students about gaming, they completely understand that there's career opportunities and prospects there. Having those same conversations with their parents pre-COVID was a very different conversation to the ones that we're now hearing that the children are having with their parents. Their parents have, you know, downloaded House Party. Their parents have seen, you know, even if it's very simple things, a way to go, oh yes, I can keep in touch with my siblings and my cousins through the world of gaming. We've certainly seen it with gaming on the careers education side. And on the B2B side, we've seen where we really struggle with skills shortage. So in the IT sector, predominantly, you know, 75% male. We have a real issue from an age demographic perspective and ensuring talent is coming up. A lot of companies are now realizing, and we've seen it in our own company, don't have to be in the country. You don't have to be in the country to be able to do the job. And you know, I've seen individuals and students taking on virtual internships, which never would have been a thing. You know, if you're based in a really, really suburban area, trying to get into central London, or certainly here trying to get into central Sydney, and the cost that comes with that is very prohibitive. Now companies are opening their eyes and employers are opening their eyes to go, we can do virtual work experience, we can do virtual training, and I'm hoping that will have a real strong impact on the skills shortage. We certainly see in the IT sector, but in other sectors for sure.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially we see it in games media. A lot of games media is based in London. If you want to be a video games journalist, if you want to be a games presenter, you know, when I was in York and I was really interested in journalism, you know, I had to go all the way down to, you know, through London to get experience with some of the magazines. And it does, you know, that's a huge barrier. So that's a really good point about, you know, I've seen video games media outlets advertising saying we're happy for remote working now. You know, we've learned in this period that it can be done, and people are working really effectively. You know, IGN has just done a summer of gaming experience now that E3 has been cancelled, where everyone's been broadcasting from their home, and it's been really successful. So yeah, that's a really good learning point.
Super interesting.
Coming back to the question on the divide and inequality, if I look at it from the perspective of personal digital media consumption, I can offer a slightly different perspective. It seems to me that traditionally digital divide was about like we have connection versus we don't have connection. Whereas I think in the present era, the meaning of digital inequality has changed. And I suspect that there could be a tendency of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer in terms of the fact that people who are better in resisting digital distractions will become even better during this time because they will be practicing their habit of resisting temptations. And those who are not so good at this will get even worse. And this is exactly what psychologists would call it, what the hell effect, which it's like a cyclic pattern of where people indulge, then they regret, and then they think that what the hell, I've screwed up. But since I've screwed up my day anyway, let me indulge a bit more. And this kind of, it becomes a vicious cycle, and the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer. So in that sense, I think COVID-19 has the chance of expanding the inequality.
Very interesting. Yeah. There's always a flip side, a negative on everything when it comes down to that. We're coming up to the top of the hour, so I want to draw things to a close, but I've got one more question from the audience that I'd like everyone just to give a 30-second answer to, which is, you know, given the decline of podcasts, it feels like video content is the way brands should communicate. So from brands, but in fact, all video content. Should we all go video is the question, yeah? Let's kick off. Adele.
No. is my answer. Actually, I don't think we should all go just video. I think when we look at, and again, it might be a regional thing. Exercise and well-being is a huge thing here. So people are still listening to audiobooks. They are still wanting to hear podcasts. Podcasts have actually been maybe surprisingly popular, perhaps just between my peer group here. I've listened to more podcasts in the last 3 months than I have in the last 3 years, because our only real way of going out was to exercise. And actually going for a run and riding my bike, if video is the only way I can consume content, it removes the option to do something else.
Great.
And my answer is very similar as well. I mean, if from a brand's perspective, I would say that probably using multiple media together will be much better than using just one form of media and ignoring the other.
Okay, good, thank you. Alicia, I know you might be a bit biased on this.
No, I completely agree with the panelists. I think what is media and content but stories, and storytelling for the longest time has been about telling stories in different ways. Imagine if we only ever read plays, you know, we would never experience poetry or books, you know. Podcasts are vital. They can tell stories in a way that video never can, you know, and the sorts of construction of a narrative and how you experience it. And yeah, you know, video is totally important and I love it. I think it's an incredible medium to get someone across that like an idea. But yes, it's not the only thing. And I do think that we'll adapt back once we come out of this and as people's lifestyles go back to normal, and we'll find those other ways of telling stories. There's probably other ways to tell stories that we've not even thought of. You know, a few years ago, no one listened to podcasts. So I'm intrigued to know what's going to be coming around the corner.
Great, thank you. Richard, I don't know if you've got any final comment on this?
No, I think what we've been seeing is a trend to a la carte media. So people choosing what they want when they want it, and the context has shifted in the last several months, and people's selections have adapted according to the availability of time and their context. But I just think that a la carte will continue, and when people are commuting again in the UK, and they'll be listening to podcasts again, and they have a bit less time in front of screens. One thing about video I do think is interesting though is that it is a very authentic and immediate medium, as we're finding here, sitting in our bedrooms or wherever we are. And there's been a very interesting swing to stop pretending so much, which I personally think is one of the most interesting trends that's gone on. So the pretending of professional life has been really, I think, very positively affected by people being interrupted by their kids or their dogs barking or they're forgetting to shave or, you know, having an old t-shirt. And I'm a big fan of that, and I hope that doesn't. I don't hope we don't all go back to pretending that we're people that don't quite necessarily represent who we really authentically are.
Brilliant. Yes, that's a very, very good point. One we could talk about for a long time in terms of pretense versus that. But we've come to the end of our time. I'd just like to. I mean, it's we could go on for hours on this. Because there are so many different perspectives, and I would really like to thank all of our panelists, you know, Snehashish, you know, Richard, Adele, Alicia. You've brought fantastic insights from multiple different perspectives, and you've made a very, very rich and engaging conversation. I've loved it, and like I said, I could go on for hours on this. Thank you very much indeed. And I'd just like now to also thank, you know, obviously all the York University Global Alumni Association, and hand over to Aiko just to wrap up the event.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, everyone, all the speakers, for your time and insight. I really enjoyed it, and I wish to do another event on this at some point. But thank you also for our participants. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and hope to see you again sometime soon, maybe online, maybe in person, and I hope you have a lovely day. So thank you, everyone. Bye.